Welcome back. This is lecture 2 within our module 11. In lecture 1, we have looked at the language areas in the brain, in the human brain. So, we looked at the basic structure of the human brain and the way the language areas were understood in the past. Those are called the classical language areas, and we also looked at how the understanding of language areas in the human brain have undergone some changes, and how we now know that the areas that were proposed before have subregions within them, and they are more complex than we previously understood. So, as a result of which there has been some new hypotheses that have been put forward. Now, how do we know all of this? This understanding of the finer understanding of the human brain in terms of language functions, we of course came to know them through various kinds of brain mapping methods, which has come up in the recent past, which last few decades. A lot of changes have taken place, lot of new machines have been invented and so on. So, before we go into the findings with respect to the neural correlates of language development, we need to understand the brain mapping methods. We will not be able to look at all of them, or let us say in very great detail, but I will give you a basic idea about some of the methods that are very important for us to understand this particular segment. And after we have looked at the brain mapping methods, we will look at some of the milestones of the language development, and then eventually of course, we will look at the neural correlates of those milestones. So, there are many different kinds of brain mapping methods available now to the scientific community. There are neuroimaging, functional neuroimaging, there is electrophysiology, and there is of course TMS. Within functional neuroimaging, we have 3 different kinds. One is called the positron emission topography, and that is PET. Then we have functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. fMRI is the functional version of the MRI. And we also have near infrared spectroscopy, NIRS. This is comparatively a newer method. Within electrophysiology, we have magnetoencephalogram, we have electroencephalogram, and there are a few more like direct cortical stimulation and so on. Direct cortical stimulation or intracranial recording are not used for children, but we will discuss them in very brief, just to give you an idea about the methods that exist, and at the end we will talk about the transcranial magnetic stimulation. So, functional neuroimaging techniques, 2 of the techniques, for example, PET and fMRI. In PET, it tracks the distribution of a radioactive isotope through the blood vessels of the brain. Both of these machines basically track the blood movement of blood in the to the brain. So, in case of PET, they track the movement of a radioactive isotope as it travels to the brain. In case of fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, it measures the blood oxygen level dependent. So, BOLD, bold signal, blood oxygen level dependent signal, which is typically manifested as a hemodynamic response function lasting roughly 10 to 12 seconds. So, basically how the blood oxygen level, how the bold signal tells us about the metabolic response of the various regions in the brain is what fMRI looks at, as opposed to PET, which looks at how the blood flow, it tracks the blood flow through radioactive isotope. This is how the machine looks. And the first one, this one is a PET measure. This is how the PET output looks, and this is how the fMRI output looks. So, this is you see the activation level. So, fully vegetative state is one kind of picture, minimally conscious and fully conscious and so on. So, there are these differences in the activation pattern. So, depending on where the radioisotope moves, accordingly those areas will be marked as active regions in the brain, because the basic idea here is that if the brain is working, when you need in order for it to function, the metabolism rate will go higher, and for higher metabolism rate you need more oxygen, and that oxygen will be supplied by the blood flow. So, that is why these techniques are blood flow dependent techniques. So, basically tracking how the area images activated. So, as you can see, dependent on that kind of method, this is how the final picture emerges. Of course, this is not how the brain looks to a naked eye, this is how the machine picks it up, and a lot of processing goes into it. But this is how the ultimately what the data, what we call data is, this is the data. Similarly, in case of fMRI also, you can see the certain areas have been marked here. So, in case of speech, these are the areas that are active. In case of finger tap, you can see this is one area that is active. While listening, you can see the areas that are active. So, this is how they are marked. So, these areas are marked based on where the blood flow was going while the function was happening. So, as a result of this, these methods have been called sort of vampire theory of the brain, because it is dependent on the blood flow. So, processing activity, any kind of processing that is happening in any of the regions, it will lead to increased metabolism. To support that metabolism, you need more oxygen, and that oxygen will be provided by the blood flow. So, this is kind of a very very circuitous way of getting to the point. It is kind of an indirect method, but anyways, the idea here is that blood flow is directly connected with neural activity. And so, if you look at the blood flow, you will be able to get to the idea of the neural activity in a particular region. So, all of these methods are called hemodynamic method, because it is dependent on the blood flow. Now, there are some issues. Of course, these machines are very sophisticated and they have been used for research in linguistics in various domains. Now, using fMRI with children has some problems because of various factors. For example, one of them is the temporal resolution of fMRI is limited. Neural events happen in milliseconds. So, when you are any kind of activity that you do, the signal in the brain, the activity in the brain will happen for a very short time. So, the neuronal firing does not last for a very long time, but the blood oxygen level changes that they induce are spread over several seconds. So, we are comparing here with an activity that spreads over seconds with something that actually takes place in milliseconds. So, there is a loss of data there. So, it is not in case of temporal resolution, fMRI is not a very good idea. That is one big problem. And with respect to children, the technique is such that it needs the patient, the person, the subject who is in the machine, they need to be still, and keeping children perfectly still is kind of a very difficult scenario. So, it is as a result of which this kind of techniques are difficult to administer with children. And also this device produces loud sounds. Loud as in for an infant, it will be a loud sound. It is not that loud, but for infants any kind of sound will be problematic, and for them it is quite loud. So, it is necessary for somebody to, the experimenter or somebody else, to shield the infant's ears while delivering the sound stimuli, because it will create a lot of difficulties. So, these are problems because of which fMRI is not used that often, or it is not a very commonly utilized tool, but it is a possible tool. So, that is about fMRI. NIRS is another machine, near infrared spectroscopy. It measures the cerebral hemodynamic response again in relation to neural activity. Now, this utilizes near infrared light to measure changes in the blood oxy and deoxyhemoglobin concentrations in the brain. So, here the method is slightly different. They are using infrared, near infrared light to look at the oxygenation and deoxygenation of the human blood hemoglobin concentration in the brain. Total blood volume changes in various regions of the cerebral cortex as a response to the various kinds of tasks. So, this system can determine the activity in specific regions of the brain by continuously monitoring the blood hemoglobin level. It is a similar kind of a machine, but here they check the hemoglobin level. Right, hemoglobin level has a direct connection to the oxygen level, and all of that. So, they are similar. Now, if you compare among these, so the in case of NIRS, the one good thing about NIRS is that there is a co-registration with other testing techniques such as EEG and MEG, that is possible. So, there is a co-registration that is possible, but limitations of NIRS is similar to fMRI, because it does not provide a very good temporal resolution, as we have just seen that mental processes will be gone in milliseconds. So, it is a very short lived time, but the time, by the time the blood oxygenation happens and we get the signal, it goes over seconds. So, there is a time lag. So, that is why temporal resolution is not very good. That is one kind of study. The other type of the machines that we have, that is the domain of electrophysiology. Now, neither PET, fMRI, NIRS, none of them map the brain activity directly, but through metabolic consequences of the brain activity. In contrast, electrophysiological techniques, they bring us much closer to the neuronal firing, because they directly pick up the electromagnetic signals from the brain as it goes, as the neuronal firing happens, the signals that they emit are picked up by the machine. So, that is why it is a more direct method compared to fMRI and other hemodynamic methods. So, one of them is direct cortical stimulation. This is not done with children typically. Normally, non-clinical patient, non-clinical participants are it does not get used for this. This is typically for patients of epilepsy and other cases. So, before epilepsy surgery, often direct electrical stimulation is used. So, the first of this kind of studies was carried out by Penfield in the late 19th century, very pretty old study. He mapped functional organization of the exposed cortex in epileptic patients prior to removing the epileptogenic areas. Basically the areas that are responsible for epilepsy. So, what happens in epileptic surgery is that when if they have to go for a surgery, there is a pre-processing that happens before the surgery, because in the surgery they will be removing certain parts of the brain. Now, while removing that part of the brain, the doctors need to make sure that by removing that part you are not hampering other functions like language. So, often they carry out certain kinds of tests to check the areas surrounding that area which are responsible for language. So, that is when it is utilized. So, what happens in this case is that there will be electrodes with very minute amount of electrical impulse passing through the open area of the brain. So, the cortex is exposed, the brain area is removed, the skull part of the skull is removed and the brain is exposed, and that is where the electrical stimulation will be applied. So, in one such case, when he applied electrode was introduced into the cortex of the superior surface of anterior temporal lobe. Superior is the upper part. So, nothing about qualitative marking here. Superior surface of an anterior temporal lobe, and a gentle current was switched on. The patient exclaimed, "Oh, a familiar memory, in an office somewhere, I could see the desks. I was there and someone was calling me, a man leaning on a desk." This looks like a person describing a scene. Remember, there was no scene like this in front of the person. All they did was passing a very minute amount of electrical stimulation in the open area of the cortex. That is the area that we talked about, and when that area was electrically stimulated, this is what the person says. So, this is one of his studies. So, following Penfield, many others have also carried out similar kind of studies. Another very important study, it is quite a landmark study. They did this kind of a experiment. The protocol of the study was line drawing of familiar objects were projected on the screen at 4-second intervals. Subjects had to name them using a matrix sentence. This is a tree, this is a table, this is a chair, like that. So, this is the matrix and they have to name. So, the object is there on the screen and they have to name. Subjects were 117 patients of epilepsy. As I said, all these were carried out only on patients no normal typically developing person would be going through this. In our initial data, all the initial data in neuroscience with whether it is about language or other mental functions, they have typically come from aphasia and epilepsy patients. So, when you talk about older data, we are always talking about the patient data, right. So, this is in this case also we have epilepsy patients. At the onset of some of the slides, the experimenter stimulated some of the predetermined points to be to the exposed cortex. So, this is already the stimulus is ready, just when it is they are about to begin, the current is passed and each site was stimulated 3 times. Patient's response was recorded for each of the responses. What did they find out? In a vast majority of cases, stimulation disrupted naming only in a few discrete sites. So, in certain domains, certain areas, naming was disrupted when the stimulation, electrical stimulation was applied. In 67% of patients, 2 or more such sites were detected, usually one in frontal cortex and another in temporal or parietal cortex. Precise anatomical location of the sites responsible for naming varied greatly among subjects. This is one of the most important findings of this study, because though there are some broad areas which were found to be responsible for naming, meaning if that area is electrically stimulated, the patient's naming will be affected. If not, then if they are not affected, that means that area is not responsible. So, that is why they found larger areas like the frontal cortex and some areas in parietal and temporal cortex. However, what is more important is that those exact areas will differ across patients. So, it is not a very not every human being has the exact same kind of area for exact same kind of functions. That is the finding. Suggests the substantial variability across population. Another kind of brain mapping technique is called intracranial recording. This is used to measure neural activity at the level of single cell, but more often they are used at the level of cell assemblies. So, small area, small region will be focused on, and this is the method. One of these methods is called electrocorticography, where they will be mapping, they will be taking the signals from inside the cranium. So, intracranial and extracranial. So, intracranial is inside the cranial, meaning inside the skull. So, directly from the brain. This involves placing a high density multi electrode grid over the exposed cortical surface. This measures the local field potential of cell assemblies. So, a region where there is cell assembly, some particular concentration area, that can be measured with sub-centimeter spatial resolution and millisecond temporal resolution, while the patient performs various linguistic tasks. This is how the electrocorticography thing looks like. So, this is a grid, this is again this is not an actual picture of any actual person, this is for representative purpose only. So, this will be, let us say this is the grid and this is what is. So, we have the motor area, we have the sensory area, then we have the this is the surgical opening, and this is what we are looking at. So, the entire grid is what we are looking at, entire region. So, how do, and the resolution will be spatially and temporally quite high resolution. So, how does that entire area function? Within that area, what kind of which area, which sub area is doing what, that is what will be picked up. So, the signals will be picked up as the person is doing some kind of a linguistic task. Again the data will be from typically from our epileptic patients. Now, we move on to the electroencephalography, which is EEG. This is how the machine looks. It is like a cap. Of course, now it comes in various other shapes, but roughly this is like a cap with many channels, many nodes, which are which are electrodes basically, which will be put on the scalp. So, there is a method through which they will be attached to the scalp, and it picks up event related potentials along the dimensions of latency, amplitude, polarity and topography. These are the things that will be, that are our variables. So, simply put, when you are busy doing something, some kind of functions, speaking or playing something, or simply you are blinking your eyes, the electrodes will pick up the signals from the area that is involved in that kind of a function, and that will be amplified through some machines, and ultimately what we see is a sine wave, and depending on that whatever the data is, we will be able to correlate with the functions. So, ERP, which is part of the EEG, reflect electrical activity, that is time locked to the presentation of a specific sensory stimulus, for example, syllables, words or a cognitive processor, whatever. So, time locked as in exactly the time when the stimulus was presented, at that time the kind of signal that the brain is giving out is what our data is, that is what the ERP will be, that is the ERP we are talking about. So, the activity of neural networks firing in a coordinated and synchronous fashion can be measured through this machine. Voltage changes occurring as a function of cortical neural activity can also be detected. ERPs provide precise time resolution, because this is ERPs are very good for temporal resolution, making them well suited for studying high speed and temporally ordered structure of the human speech. So, EEGs are very useful for studying human language because of the very good temporal resolution. This can be also carried out in populations who, because of age or cognitive impairment, cannot provide overt responses, because here you do not have to do anything. For example, you can just be sitting and with the cap on, and you are looking at some pictures or some even linguistic stimuli on the screen. So, as you are reading them, you are just looking at them, your brain is processing that information, right. So, that processing itself will be picked up by the machine. So, you do not need to do as such anything, overtly do anything. So, that is why this machine is very useful. Even with children, you just put the cap on, and it is because it is safe, it does not harm them or does not cause any inconvenience. So, you can see how happy the child is. This is of course, a picture that I have taken from the web. So, this is why it is very useful to be used both with the aged or with the old, all kinds of situations it can be utilized. But the only problem is that the spatial location, spatial resolution is slightly limited in this kind of a thing. So, the main ERP components that we will typically refer to when we talk about language processing. Of course, there are many, but the most important ones are N400. N400 basically refers to the negative, as I said, this is the data, the final thing that the output that the machine gives you is a sine wave. So, in this kind, in N400, it is the negative going peak at 400 milliseconds. That is what is that is what N400 is all about. Now, this is this peak we will see it in response to semantic anomaly. So, when a sentence is semantically anomalous. So, for example, the man beat the dog. So, the dog biting a man is fine, but man biting a dog is well, can be possible, but there is something off. So, in that case you might find, or let us say you hear a sentence like I take my coffee with without sugar and sky. Till without sugar things were going fine, but the moment you hear or you look at the word sky, the brain will give you the N400 impact, the machine will give you the N400. That is what N400 does. Then we have P600, another important indicator of processing. This is a positive going peak reflecting syntactic processing and reanalysis at 600 milliseconds. Then we have MMN, mismatch negativity. It is a negative going component. This is seen when a listener detects a change in the repetitive sequence of sounds. So, this is used often to investigate phonetic comprehension in children. For example, if you are hearing a lot of sounds one after another, there is a certain one at one point there is a foreign sound. It is not part of the sound that is part of your own language. In that case, we might see the this MMN signal. Then LAN, left anterior negativity, it is used for early syntactic processing, generally in case of grammatical error. So, these are some of the main variables that are out that we see in case of when we use EEG. Then another machine that is called MEG, magnetoencephalography. This is another brain imaging technique that tracks the activity of the brain using with exquisite temporal resolution, very good temporal resolution. This has the this has this kind of a method which is called superconducting quantum interference device. This sensor is located within the MEG helmet. This is also like a cap or a helmet kind of a structure. This measures the minute magnetic fields associated with electrical currents produced by the brain while performing any kind of task. Maybe it can be sensory, it can be motor, or it can be cognitive task. So, it is kind of similar, but this picks up the magnetic fields, fluctuation in the magnetic field while the brain is doing things. So, this allows precise partial localization of neural currents responsible for the sources of the magnetic fields. Phonetic discrimination in newborns and infants in the first year of life have been extensively studied using MEG, because these are all harmless kind of tools and it does not cause any kind of inconvenience to the children. So, as a result of which a lot of infant studies on infant language acquisition have used EEG and MEG. So, latest studies employ sophisticated head tracking software as well and hardware that allow correction for infants head movements and examine multiple brain areas in infants as they listen to speech. So, these are very sophisticated machines that are being used today, MEG and EEG both, and as I said they are completely safe and noiseless. So, very safe to use with children and as a result of which quite common. The final machine that we are talking about is transcranial magnetic stimulation. Now, what this does is it does not it is neither you do not have to open up the skull nor you are putting a cap, but it is a very strong magnetic, not very strong in the sense of course, it has to be used with normal human beings as well. So, it creates a magnetic field from outside of the brain. So, it alters the organization of the neural activity in a target cortical area by projecting a magnetic field through the overlying skull. So, from outside the head, it is not attached to the head, it is outside, and then it can apply, as you can see from the machine, it applies a magnetic, it literally messes with your head. So, it creates it alters the neural activity. The temporal resolution is in the order of milliseconds and spatial resolution is in terms of millimeters. So, quite good resolution. The parameters of the protocol, mainly the frequency of pulses, can be adjusted so that one can either facilitate or support the operation of the target region. So, it is a very sophisticated machine, because you are applying this from outside, you are applying this kind of a magnetic, you are creating a different kind of magnetic field there. So, it can be depending on what you are looking at. Are you helping that particular region's magnetic field by increasing it, or you can also change the pulse in order to suppress it. So, it can be both a positive or a negative, it can be utilized in a both positive or as in facilitating or inhibiting way, depending on whatever your research question is or whatever it is that you are looking for. And then depending on whatever the function that the human brain is carrying out, that is what our data is. So, these are the various kinds of techniques that are used for language processing studies as well as language acquisition studies. As far as infants are concerned, more use of MEG and EEG are seen as opposed to the other ones. In case of normal typical children, if it is an epileptic patient's case, of course, we have the other machine, other possibilities like an open brain kind of a probe, but that is only in case of epileptic patients. So, before pre-surgery processes, that is when we see them, but otherwise in case of normal children, we do not use them, only the EEG and MEG are typically used. So, these are some of the most important tools. Now, when we look at the basic milestones of language acquisition among children, there are some very important milestones. We have already looked at them before, but just to brush up. So, in the initial stages, the first 6 months we have universal categorical perception, then we have perceptual narrowing, followed by first signs of word comprehension, followed by word production, and then of course, we have grammatical development of grammatical rules and larger sentences and so on. So, in the very beginning, in the case of infants, in the beginning of their life, we have seen that they are capable of categorical perception across languages. So, it is not only one language, but they are able to, if you recall in the beginning, we have seen that in the phonological section, where infants are capable of distinguishing between sounds that are non-native as well. So, they can distinguish between native, non-native sounds, they can distinguish between mother's voice, other female voices, own language, other languages, all kinds of things. So, the perceptual abilities are on very high, the acuity is very strong. So, they can, it is almost nearly universal. All infants are capable of distinguishing various kinds of sounds. So, that in the beginning it is very strong. However, this capacity is dramatically altered by language experiences starting as early as 6 months for vowels and 10 months for consonants. At 6 months, infants begin to organize speech sounds into categories based on phonetic prototypes. We have seen it already before, that after some time, that ability to distinguish between sounds across different languages, even non-native languages, that diminishes, because the idea is, as they learn, as they are exposed to the more input from their own language, their phonetic categories get created, the phonemes get created in their brain, and as a result of which they have some good examples of that category. So, around that you have native language magnet theory we have talked about. So, around that prototype they create their categories in their own language. So, it is the most frequently occurring phonetic unit in their language, which is the prototype. So, reasons for the change in infants perception between 6 and 12 months of age has been put down to by various researchers as what is called the implicit learning, because of the environmental input. So, early exposure to speech induces an implicit learning process that reduces the infant's initial ability to hear distinction even between the foreign language sounds. So, as the ambient language gets ingrained in the brain, they create the prototypes and they stop recognizing the other languages. The second half of the first year is very important because of this, because this happens to be a very sensitive period of speech learning. So, these infants are, the idea is if they are exposed, if the learning happens around this time, does it mean that if you expose them to another language, new language, will they learn? This was the idea that Kuhl and her colleagues looked at. So, they exposed American infants to Mandarin Chinese in the laboratory between 9 and 10 months of age, and found, very interesting finding, that infants learnt if exposure occurred through interaction with a human being. So, children at this level, at this stage, they can learn a new language if they are exposed to it by a human being, not by some kind of a robot or something. So, if it is through television or an audio tape with no live human interaction, then they do not learn. So, this actually gives us the idea that they are learning, and this gives you an evidence of the learning, reinforcing the phonological structure of their own language, and that is why by the end of the first year their brain no longer exhibits the universal capacity for all languages. Now, it is now primed to acquire the language to which the infant is exposed. So, this is the first stage of the learning, and then this will be giving rise to the second stage. This narrowing, perceptual narrowing, now gives rise to the next. So, how learning produces this narrowing of perceptual abilities now has become focus of intense study, because it demonstrates that the brain's shaping by experience during a very critical period of language acquisition, that learning actually plays a role. That is what Kuhl and her colleagues have shown, that initially it is all they are able to perceive all kinds of different sound distinctions, but over a period of time this changes, and that perceptual narrowing is dependent on their learning, implicit learning. It is not conscious, but implicit learning. So, major changes in the frontal lobe activity seem to coincide with this particular stage of language acquisition. This is also called the watershed, 8 to 10 month watershed because major changes happen, not only this perceptual narrowing that happens, but also because of comprehension, communication, imitation and reasoning. So, the frontal lobe activity goes very high that time. So, there is a lot of coinciding things that are happening. The next stage, the which is the comprehension stage, generally between 8 to 10 months. The word production typically begins at 11 to 13 months after this. So, this is called the vocabulary burst, that is a rapid acceleration in the rate at which new words are learned. Now, this is called a vocabulary burst, and then we also have another rapid burst of grammatical development much later at 20 to 30 months. So, these are the stages that follows the first year, and then after this we have this particular stage. Now, around the same time there are some changes in the neural organization as well. So, the period between 8 to 10 months is a what we have just seen is called a behavioral watershed, because many other things also they learn, characterized by a marked change in the or reorganization of different domains. In linguistic terms, rapid growth in speech perception, production and word comprehension happens. Behaviorally, what happens? Memory and categorization, imitation, joint reference and intentional communications develop. So, at the same time you see there are many things happening at the same time. So, this kind of this set of correlated changes have been explained by a very famous, very well known publication, where they propose that with the achievement of adult like patterns of connectivity and brain metabolism that happens at that time. During this, as we will see in the next segment, that certain kinds of activities and connections that are built up during this time, it almost resembles the adult adult brain's connectivity that develops around this time. So, the idea that was put forward is because of this connections that are developing simultaneously, when you see this kind of linguistic and behavioral output, they are probably correlated. Causation has not been proposed, but correlated certainly may be. So, particularly involving the frontal lobes. Again, the period between 16 to 30 months sees a series of sharp non-linear increase in expressive language. This is when you see including exponential increase in both vocabulary and grammar. This is what happens around 1.5 year onward. So, 16 months onward to 30 months, there is a sharp increase in the language ability again. This is estimated that a marked increase in the synaptic density and brain metabolism also takes place around the same time. Synaptogenesis is a very important aspect of the brain development, which seems to happen around the same time when the burst of grammatical categories and longer sentences and so on happens. Thus, a possible link was proposed between this series of behavioral bursts and the neural changes. However, this has been later revised, but this still remains a very important hypothesis. So, this is where we stop the second lecture. Thank you.